The demand curve tells the story of how much consumers will buy at every price. That story can change. For example, the demand for umbrellas changes when it rains. When it's raining, people want more umbrellas, and when it's not raining, they don't need as many. The demand for sports cars changes when incomes rise. And the demand for orange juice changes when we're persuaded to have a healthy dose of vitamin C every day. Changes in demand typically cause the price of the good and the quantity sold to change as well, as we'll investigate later. This module explores the reasons for changes in demand and the demand curve shifts that result. The key idea that you need to focus on in this module is that the demand curve for a good can shift or move to the right or left for 5 different reasons. 1 would be changes in people's tastes and preferences. 2, a change in income. 3 would be a change in the price of related goods. 4, expectations about the future. And 5, the number of buyers in a market. So the first thing that I will do is to identify for you what causes the demand curve to the shift to the left, which leads to a decrease in demand, and what causes it to shift to the right, leading to an increase in demand. Then I'll distinguish for you between 2 very important economic terms that students easily confuse. Economists differentiate between quantity demanded and demand. They don't mean the same thing, and we'll look at their separate meanings. And then finally, I'll explain how goods are categorized as normal goods, inferior goods, substitutes, and complements. So let's get started. In the last module, we saw that a change in the price of a good causes a movement along the demand curve for that good. Consider the movement from point A to point B in the graph, okay, which shows that for $1, okay, consumers would buy 100 oranges. Okay, so what would that look like? Well, at $1, we see we're at point A, and they would buy 100 oranges. Okay, fine. But what if the price changes to 75 cents? Then what happens? Well, when the price goes down to 75 cents, consumers will now buy 200 oranges, and that's represented by point B. And you can see the downward sloping arrow moving from point A to point B, showing that this is called movement along the demand curve. Because when we go from point A to point B, we're not moving the entire demand curve to the right or to the left. We're just moving from one point on the demand curve, point A, to another point on the demand curve, which is point B. And what has caused this to happen is a change in the price of a good. The price going from $1 to 75 cents. Now, as we look at how changes in price cause movements along this curve, we are assuming that all other influences on the purchase of oranges do not change. Now suppose that a successful advertising campaign makes people more aware of the health benefits of eating oranges. This will change people's tastes for oranges, and at any particular price, people will be willing to buy more oranges than before. So we looked at panel A in the previous slide. Now look to the right at panel B. What happens here? Okay. We see that this will cause the entire demand curve to shift to the right, from demand 1 to demand 2. In the previous graph, when we were at point A, at a price of $1, people demanded 100 oranges. But now, because of their increased preference for oranges, because of the advertising campaign, at a price of $1, people will now be willing to purchase 150 oranges. That's a difference. Consider the quantity that was demanded at a price of $1. Previously, they were buying 100, now we buy 150. So while the effect of a price change was illustrated by sliding a pencil along the existing demand curve, the effect of a change in tastes is illustrated by picking up the pencil and drawing a new curve. A shift of the demand curve means that at every price, the amount people are willing and able to buy has changed. In the previous figure, you saw an example of a rightward shift of the demand curve. We call that an increase in demand. This figure illustrates another possible shift of the demand curve for oranges, this time to the left. Well, in this one, this one's moving to the right, and that illustrates the demand for oranges moving to the right. But if we move to the next graph, now we see the shifting of the demand curve to the left. But what would cause this leftward shift? Well, suppose the price of apples decreases. Many people are content with either apples or oranges. So when apples become less expensive, more people will choose apples over oranges. And at a price of $1, for example, people will now demand fewer oranges. People are now willing to buy only 50 oranges, as shown by point D, instead of the 100 they were buying at point A. So notice now, because of their decreased demand, they're buying 50 at a price of $1 when before they were buying 100 at a price of $1. So that has all changed. And so obviously, if the price is remaining the same, we're not changing our demand for oranges because of a change in the price. The price is still $1. So something else must have caused us to decrease our demand for oranges, just like in the previous example, something caused us to increase our demand for oranges. So the quantity of oranges people are willing to buy decreases at other prices too, and so this causes a shift to the left of the demand curve. So let's take another look at terms with precise meanings in economics. We've seen that the quantity demanded refers to a particular quantity that people want to buy at a specific price, while demand refers to the relationship between price and quantity demanded as represented by the entire demand curve. The proper use of these terms helps us distinguish between a movement along the demand curve and a shift of the demand curve. So let's go back to a previous slide to see this. When we move along a demand curve, we call the resulting change in the quantity that consumers want to buy a change in the quantity demanded. For example, in this panel, the drop in price from $1 to 75 cents caused a movement along demand curve D1 and an increase in the quantity demanded from 100 oranges to 200 oranges. But now let's go to another slide that we focused on before. And look at a shift of the demand curve. When the demand curve shifts, we call the change in consumers' willingness to buy the product a change in demand. For example, in this panel, the change in taste in favor of oranges caused an increase in demand, shown as a shift from demand curve 1 to demand curve 2, an entirely new demand curve. Now, if you are asked by someone, what happens to the demand for running shoes when there is a citywide sale and prices are marked down, the correct answer is nothing happens to demand. And you might look at that and say, what do you mean nothing happens? The price went down. Doesn't the demand increase? No. Demand refers to the entire demand curve. And a change in price does not cause the demand curve itself to change. The sale on running shoes causes a movement along the demand curve, but this is an increase in quantity demanded at every particular price. This is not an increase in demand. If the announcement of a new race led to an increase in the quantity of running shoes consumers were willing to buy at any given price, that would constitute an increase in demand. So it is critical that you understand the difference between a change in demand and a change in quantity demanded. The only thing that causes a change in quantity demanded is the change of a price of a good, either up or down, leading to an increase or decrease in the quantity demanded of the good and causing a movement along the demand curve. If there is a change in demand, then something else has caused our demand to increase or decrease. The only thing that causes a change in quantity demanded is a change in price. If anything else changes that influences our demand for a good, we call that a change in demand. If it causes us to demand more, we call that an increase in demand. If it causes us to demand less, we call that a decrease in demand. So, what would cause the demand curve to shift? Well, let's find out. You have learned up until this point that when the price of a good changes, it causes a change in the quantity demanded. And changes in some other factors cause the entire demand curve to shift. But what are these factors that shift the demand curve? The 5 emphasized by economists because they play a central role in many markets are tastes, income, the prices of related goods, expectations, and the number of buyers. Let's explore each of these in turn. Particular styles of goods, including clothing, jewelry, music, cars, and computers, rise and fall in popularity. Depending on the year, for example, the jeans in fashion might have straight, flared, or boot-cut legs, and they might be low-rise, stone-washed, distressed, baggy, or tight. Tastes change and styles go in and out of favor for many reasons. Sometimes the wardrobes of famous people influence the tastes of the broader population, as when the styles of first ladies and royalty cause buying frenzies, or sometimes a particular decade, like that represented here, the 80s, develops its own sense of fashion style. Firms try to influence tastes by hiring advertising agencies to promote new products and styles. A successful ad campaign convinces customers to be willing to buy more of a good or service at every price. Earlier, you saw how a change in taste can shift the demand curve for oranges by changing the quantity demanded at every price. Likewise, if a style of jeans, a hairstyle, a type of music, or a style of car becomes more attractive to consumers, the demand curve for that product will shift to the right, as we saw in panel B of a previous figure. If a good becomes less popular or attractive and goes out of style or out of fashion, the demand curve will shift to the left, as we saw in the other previous figure. So what else can cause a change in demand? Well, a change in income. The amount of money people earn affects the amount they are willing and able to spend. A rise in income means there is more money to spend on consumption. A fall in income generally causes people to cut back on the quantity of goods they buy. What would happen to your purchases of clothing if your income fell because you lost your after-school job? Chances are they would fall. If the demand for a particular good rises when income falls, we call it a normal good. Most goods are normal goods. For example, when people have more income, they tend to buy more newspapers, cars, fruit juice, televisions, and restaurant meals. Not all goods are normal goods, however. For the goods known as inferior goods, a rise in income actually leads to a fall in demand. Here are some examples of normal goods and inferior goods. Televisions, automobiles are examples of normal goods. But if you look at inferior goods, an example might be intercity bus transportation. Buses are popular among students and others with relatively low incomes. A rise in income leads people to take buses less frequently and instead drive or take a plane between cities. In developing countries such as India and China, bicycles are an inferior good. As people become wealthier, they tend to buy more cars and fewer bicycles. Canned meat and processed cheese are other examples of inferior goods. For a normal good, a rise in income causes a rightward shift of the demand curve. When income rises, people want to buy more of the normal good at every price. For an inferior good, a rise in income causes the demand curve to shift to the left. At every price, people want to buy less of the inferior good when income is high than when income is low. The third thing that can affect our demand for a good or service is the price of related goods. Earlier, we saw that when the price of apples fell, people ate more apples and fewer oranges. This shifted the demand curve for oranges. In other words, a change in the price of one good can shift the demand curve for another good. Consider the demand curve for hot dogs. What would happen if the price of hamburgers increased? We would expect some consumers to switch from eating hamburgers to eating hot dogs to avoid the new higher price of hamburgers. This would shift the demand curve for hot dogs to the right. The price of hamburgers affects the demand for hot dogs because hot dogs and hamburgers are substitutes for each other. When two goods are substitutes, an increase in the price of one leads to an increase in the demand for the other. The opposite is true as well. A decrease in the price of a substitute encourages some customers to switch to that good, which decreases demand for the other. DVDs are a substitute for movie downloads. Tea is a substitute for coffee, and Burger King hamburgers are a substitute for McDonald's burgers. Now, some pairs of goods go well together. For example, buns and hot dogs are what we call complementary goods. When people buy one of these goods, they are likely to also buy the other. When two goods are complements, an increase in the price of one of the goods leads to a decrease in the price of the other. Suppose the price of buns increases. Eating a hot dog on a bun will now be more expensive, so people will buy fewer hot dogs at every price for hot dogs. The demand for hot dogs decreases, and the demand curve for hot dogs shifts leftward. Similar complementary relationships exist between other goods. If the price of maple syrup rises, a meal of pancakes with syrup becomes more expensive, so the demand curve for pancakes will shift to the left. If the price of gasoline rises, the demand curve for SUVs will shift to the left. And if the price of tennis balls rises, the demand curve for tennis rackets will shift to the left. These effects work in reverse as well. If the price of gasoline falls, it will become less expensive to drive an SUV, and the demand curve for SUVs will shift to the right, and there will be an increase in the demand for SUVs. The fourth factor that can affect our demand for a good is future expectations. Your expectations about the future price of a good can influence your demand for that good today. If you think the price of a good will fall in the future, you are likely to postpone your purchase of that good until the price is lower. Because expectations about future prices affect the quantity you demand at every price, they cause demand curves to shift. For example, there is a leftward shift in the demand curve for Macy's clothing in the days before a major sale. Expectations that the price of a good will rise in the future lead people to buy more of it today. For example, suppose consumers expect the price of gasoline to increase soon, perhaps due to a new conflict in oil-producing countries. Many are likely to buy more gasoline now, even if their gas tanks are far from empty. This increases in the quantity of gasoline demanded at every price shifts the demand curve for gasoline to the right. A similar situation occurs when consumers know that a change in sales taxes is coming up. Many states temporarily suspend the sales tax on clothing and other items for a week before school starts each year to encourage families to go shopping, especially for back-to-school items. If it is late July or early August and people know there will be no sales tax in a week or two, they will probably postpone some of their purchases. The future opportunity for tax-free purchases causes people to buy less clothing at every price today, which shifts the demand curve for clothing to the left. This is a shift in the demand curve and not a movement along it because people buy less clothing even though the price did not change. Like changing expectations about prices, changing expectations about future income affect the demand for goods today. Rather than waiting for an anticipated increase in income to arrive before spending some of it, consumers like to spread out their expenditures. If new information about a job offer or a raise brings you to expect a higher income in the future, your consumption of normal goods is likely to increase now. You might buy a new outfit or upgrade your laptop. When the economy as a whole shows strong signs of improvement, many people expect higher incomes in the future, and the demand curves for many normal goods shift rightward. Going in the other direction, if there is a forecast of lower incomes in the future, people start spending less immediately, and the demand curves for many normal goods shift leftward. The fifth and final factor that can shift a demand curve is the number of buyers in the market. Remember that to draw the market demand curve, we add together the quantities demanded by each of the individual consumers at every price. If the number of consumers in a market increases, say because the population grows, then the market demand curve shifts to the right. The figure in front of you takes the market for gasoline from a previous figure and adds a third consumer, Tanya. Let me go back to that screen there. At each price, as we can see, Tanya's demand for quantity demanded to Alicia's and Fred's, we add it to find the quantity demanded in the market. The blue demand curve right here represents the original market demand before Tanya joined the market. However, the red market demand curve right here represents the market after Tanya joins it. The shift that we see from the blue curve to the red one, moving to the right, illustrates how the addition of buyers shifts the market demand curve to the right. Additionally, if Tanya left the market or if other consumers left the market and there were fewer buyers, the demand curve would shift to the left.